Hello, Namaste and welcome you all. Since the last several lectures, we have been discussing about PV ratio, which stands for profit volume ratio. But as we discussed in the last lecture, PV ratio is not profit to sales ratio, it is contribution to sales ratio. That's why this ratio is also known as contribution ratio or marginal ratio. In previous lecture, we discussed that what PV ratio tells us. As we know, the accounting is the language of business. So everything passes somewhat meaning. Suppose PV ratio is 10%. What meaning it passes? What does it mean? What that PV ratio tells us? Suppose PV ratio is 10%. It means contribution is 10% of sales. It means fixed cost is 10% of BP sales, and it means profit is 10% of margin of safety sales, as we discussed in the previous lecture. In our last lecture, we have also discussed the co-relationship between sales, contribution and PV ratio, and we also discussed the various formulas available to calculate the PV ratio. Now, what today we are going to discuss? Today we are going to discuss which items we can calculate by using PV ratio. As we know, in the marginal costing technique problems, we are asked to find out the missing items. So while solving problems of marginal costing technique, we have to find out missing items, and while finding out that missing items, students get confused how to calculate that missing items or find out these missing items. So if you are confused, just do one thing. First, calculate the PV ratio, and when you know about the PV ratio, means if you know PV ratio, then you can calculate near about 90% items of marginal costing technique. You can see, if you know PV ratio, by using the same PV ratio, you can calculate near about 9 items you can calculate by using PV ratio. Means if you know PV ratio, then near about 90% items of marginal costing technique you can find out. In that way, you can solve any problem. Near about any problem you can solve easily if you know PV ratio. And how to solve or which items we can calculate or find out by using PV ratio, we are going to discuss now with the help of one practical problem. So let's start. So what we are going to discuss? Which items we can calculate by using PV ratio with the help of one practical problem. So this is our one practical problem. In our problem, per unit selling price, which is rupees 10, number of units sold, which is 10. So 10 selling price into number of units 10 into 10, total rupees 100 will be the amount of sales. Next, per unit variable cost, which is rupees 9, number of units 10. So 9 into 10, 90 will be total variable cost. Next, total fixed cost, which is rupees 4. This is our data of problem. Total fixed cost is only 4. If you see this problem, you can realize the figures which I have taken are very small. Why? So as to you can understand very easily. That's why I have taken very small figures. So if we process this data, then we can calculate some items. These items we have calculated or processed by using these 3 items or this problem. So what will be the total cost? As we know, total cost is a sum of total variable cost and total fixed cost. So total variable cost is 90. 9 units, number of units 10, 9 into 10, 90, total variable cost 90 plus total fixed cost, which is 4. So 90 plus 4, 94 will be the total cost. Next, what will be the amount of profit? How to calculate profit? Total sales less total cost is equal to profit. So total sales, which is 100, total sales less total cost, which is 94. 100 less 94, remaining rupees 6 will be the amount of total profit. Next, what will be the per unit contribution? How to calculate per unit contribution? As we know, per unit selling price less per unit variable cost. So per unit contribution is equal to per unit selling price, which is rupees 10, less per unit variable cost, which is rupees 9. So selling price 10 less per unit variable cost 9. Per unit contribution will be rupee 1. Next, what will be the contribution in total or total contribution? How to calculate it? Total sales less total variable cost is equal to total contribution. So total contribution is equal to total sales less total variable cost. Total sales, which is 100, less total variable cost, which is 90. So 100 less 90, rupees 10 will be the amount of total contribution. Next, now we are going to calculate BP units. BP units. As we discussed in the previous lectures, when BP stage comes, when the total contribution amount and the amount of total fixed cost becomes exactly equal, then BP stage comes. Why? Because it is the amount of contribution which is utilized to recover the total fixed cost. Suppose this pen is our unit. Selling price of this pen is suppose rupees 10. Variable cost of manufacturing it is rupees 9. So we have sold this pen for rupees 10. Then we will get 10 rupees. Out of that 10 rupees variable cost, rupees 9 will get recovered immediately, and 1 rupee will remain. 10 rupees selling price, our variable cost 9 will get recovered, 1 rupee will remain. That 1 rupee will recover our total fixed cost. Means that 1 rupee will be utilized to recover our total fixed cost. Means when we sell 1 unit, then 1 rupee will remain. If we sell 2 units, then 2 rupees will remain. If we sell 4 units, then 4 rupees will utilize to recover our total fixed cost. And how much is our total fixed cost, which is rupees 4. So that 4 rupees will be utilized to recover our total fixed cost. Means when our contribution will become exactly equal to the total fixed cost, then BP stage comes. That's why that units known as BP units. How we are going to understand now? Total fixed cost, as we discussed in the previous lecture, the amount of total fixed cost and the amount of contribution at BP level, not total contribution. Amount of contribution at BP level and the amount of total fixed cost is always equal. Amount of contribution at BP level. Contribution at BP level amount and amount of total fixed cost is always equal in marginal costing. So total fixed cost means also amount of contribution at BP level. So which is rupees 4. Because fixed cost is 4, means contribution amount at BP level will also be 4. Divided by per unit contribution rupee 1. So how many units we will have to sell to recover our total fixed cost? If we sell 1 unit, then 1 rupee we can recover. So we will sell 4 units, then 4 rupees fixed cost we will recover. In that way, BP units will be 4. 4 units will be BP units. Now what will be the BP sales in rupees? These are BP in units. Now BP sales in rupees. So BP sales in rupees equal to BP units into per unit selling price. BP units 4 into per unit selling price 10. 4 into 10, rupees 40 will be the BEP stage. BEP stage means the stage when total cost and total sales are exactly equal. And when it happens, when companies total contribution and total fixed cost becomes exactly equal, then BEP stage comes. When the amount of contribution and amount of fixed cost becomes exactly equal, then BEP stage comes. Then what will be the margin of safety sales? Margin of safety sales means this is a difference between total sales and BEP sales. Or in other words, we can say margin of safety is excess of total sales over BEP sales. Or in formula way, margin of safety is equal to total sales less BEP sales. So total sales, which is 100, less BEP sales, which is 40. So 100 less 40 is equal to 60. Rupees 60 is the amount of margin of safety. Then we are going to understand, as we know, BEP sales and margin of safety sales are the parts of total sales. Okay, so BEP sales, which is rupees 40, plus margin of safety sales, which is rupees 60. So total sales is 100. Okay, now we are going to understand, we are going to calculate PV ratio. PV ratio means contribution to sales ratio. So as the name indicates, contribution to sales ratio. So PV ratio is equal to contribution to sales ratio. Contribution, which is rupees 10. Contribution, which is rupees 10. Sales 100 less total variable cost 90. Contribution is 10. Contribution 10 divided by sales 100. So 10 upon 100 into 100. So PV ratio, that is contribution to sales ratio, is 10%. What we discuss up to this stage, we have discussed one problem. This is our data given in the problem, and by using that data we have find out these atoms. Okay, now we are going to verify how we can calculate these atoms by using PV ratio. The atoms which we have calculated here, the same atoms we can calculate by using PV ratio. Because in problems of marginal costing technique, we have to calculate missing figures. In problems, some atoms are not given, some information is not given, and on basis of this limited or insufficient information, we have to calculate the missing atoms. So that's why we must have knowledge how to calculate this. So we can use these atoms by using PV ratio. How? Now we are going to discuss. If we know the PV ratio, then how many atoms we can calculate? Total 9 atoms we can calculate by using PV ratio. Which are these 9 atoms? First, contribution. If we know PV ratio, then we can, by using that PV ratio, we can calculate contribution, total fixed cost, profit, then total sales, then BEP sales, then margin of safety sales, then VC ratio or variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio, and total variable cost, and sales for desired profit. These 9 atoms we can calculate by using PV ratio. Means while solving problems of marginal costing technique, if you are confused, if you don't know how to solve that problem, then just first calculate the PV ratio. PV ratio is a key factor, is a key to solve the problems of marginal costing technique. If you don't know how to solve the problem, then first calculate the PV ratio, and by using that PV ratio you can calculate 9 atoms, means near about 90% atoms of marginal costing technique you can calculate by using PV ratio. So which are these 9 atoms and how to calculate or find out these 9 atoms by using PV ratio, now we are going to discuss. So let's start with first. As we know, suppose PV ratio is 10%. Here also PV ratio is 10%. Contribution is 10 divided by sales, which is 100 into 100. So contribution 10 is 10% of 100, that is sales. So PV ratio is 10% in this example also. PV ratio is 10%, it means contribution is 10% of sales. It means fixed cost is 10% of BEP sales. It means profit is 10% of margin of safety sales. How? You can see here. If you have sales and PV ratio, then you can calculate the amount of contribution. Sales 100 into PV ratio is equal to rupees 10 is a contribution. Why? Because PV ratio tells us that contribution is 10% of sales. So sales is 100, so 10% of 100 is 10, which is the amount of contribution. PV ratio tells us that contribution is, if PV ratio is 10% means contribution is 10% of sales. So sales is 100, so 10% of 100 is 10 will be the amount of contribution. In same way, if PV ratio is 10% means fixed cost is 10% of BEP sales. You can see, if you have taken BEP sales which is rupees 40, BEP sales rupees 40 into PV ratio 10%. So 10% of 40 will be 4. That is the amount of total fixed cost. Why? Because the amount of contribution at BEP level, and amount of total fixed cost is always equal. That's why it happens. So total BEP sales into PV ratio is equal to total fixed cost. Then third, margin of safety sales. Margin of safety sales which is rupees 60. So that's why we have taken 60 into PV ratio. So margin of safety rupees 60 into 10%. So 10% of rupees 60 is 6. That is the amount of profit. You can see profit is 6. You can see total fixed cost we have calculated by using PV ratio which is 4. You can see that is 4. In first case also the contribution we have calculated by using PV ratio is 10. You can see that contribution is rupees 10. Means the items we have calculated here, the same items we can calculate by using PV ratio. So these 9 formulas you must have to remember. So by using these 9 formulas you can calculate 9 items, near about 90% items of marginal costing technique you can calculate by using PV ratio, and you can easily will solve the problems. So now we are moving towards fourth formula. Contribution upon PV ratio is equal to total sales, because contribution is 10% of sales. So if contribution is divided by 10%, then we will get the amount of total sales. You can see your contribution is rupees 10. If that contribution is divided by 10% PV ratio, so then we get amount of total sales. You can see contribution 10 is 10% of total sales. Means if you know PV ratio and contribution, then you can calculate total sales. By using PV ratio we have calculated total sales which is 100. You can verify total sales which is rupees 100. And here we have calculated total sales by using PV ratio by dividing contribution by PV ratio. Next, fifth, total fixed cost upon PV ratio. So total fixed cost means the amount of contribution at BEP level upon PV ratio is equal to BEP sales. You can see total fixed cost which is rupees 4 divided by 10%. So 4 is 10% of 40, means 4, that is total fixed cost is 10% of BEP sales which is rupees 40. You can see BEP sales 40, BEP sales 40. Then sixth, profit divided by PV ratio is equal to margin of safety. Profit is 6. You can see profit is 6 divided by 10% PV ratio. So 6 divided by 10%. 6 is 10% of 60. So 60 is a margin of safety. You can see we have calculated margin of safety by using PV ratio which is rupees 60. You can see margin of safety is rupees 60. Then next, if we have to calculate variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio, that also we can calculate by using PV ratio. So formula for calculating VC ratio or marginal cost ratio is 100% less PV ratio. So 100% less PV ratio is 10% is equal to 90% is the variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio. As we discussed in the previous last lecture, that VC ratio means what it tells us? It tells us that variable cost is 90% of sales. You can see variable cost is 90, which is 90% of sales. Sales is 100, and 90 is 90% of 100, means variable cost is 90% of sales. So we have calculated directly variable cost ratio 100%. 100%, suppose sales is 100%, less 10% PV ratio. PV ratio means contribution ratio. So sales less contribution ratio, so remaining will be variable cost ratio, because sales less contribution is equal to variable cost. So sales percentage less contribution percentage, so remaining will be variable cost percentage. That's why it happens. Next, second last, what we can calculate? We can directly calculate the amount of total variable cost. How? Sales less PV ratio. Sales which is 100, less PV ratio means contribution ratio. So contribution is 10% of sales, so remaining will be variable cost. So sales 100 less 10% of 100. 10% of 100 is 10. So 100 less 10 is equal to rupees 90 is the amount of total variable cost. You can see total variable cost which is rupees 90, which we have calculated by using PV ratio. Then last, we can calculate sales for desired profit or sales for expected profit. How we can calculate the same? The desired profit, which the amount of profit which we desire to earn, that profit we have to write here, plus total fixed cost, prevailing fixed cost, divided by PV ratio. Then we will get the amount of sales for desired profit. So now we have discussed how we can calculate the 9 items. These 9 items we can calculate by using PV ratio, because in the problems of marginal costing we are asked to calculate the missing items by using insufficient information. So you can see, if you have if you know 2 variables, you can calculate third variable quickly. Okay, so which items we can calculate by PV ratio? First, contribution, second total fixed cost, then profit, then total sales, then BP sales, then margin of safety sales, then variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio, then total variable cost, and then sales for desired profit. Total 9 items we can calculate by using PV ratio. So today what we have discussed? We have discussed how to calculate various items by using PV ratio. Means today we have discussed how PV ratio works as a key to solve the problems. Means if you know PV ratio, if you know only one PV ratio, then you can calculate near about 90% or 9 items total you can easily calculate. Means if while solving problem of marginal costing technique, if you are confused how to solve it, if you don't know how to solve the problem of marginal costing, then first calculate the PV ratio and remember these 9 formulas. Then you can easily solve that problem. Okay, so I hope all of you understood it. Thank you.